We have to give thumbs up. Ready, sir? You ready? Okay. So today I'm going to talk about roles and permissions with a software package called Lock. Normally, I completely disagree with using a software package for permissions and roles because just normally it's too restrictive, but Lock has some really good capabilities, and that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Charles Griffin, and I'm a software engineer at Indatus. So what this talks about is roles and permissions that aren't painful. Allows you to have some flexibility in how you, basically Lock allows you to have your own database schema, and I'm going to show you that later for how you manage your roles and permissions, and it doesn't get in the way, which is pretty impressive. Using Lock as a Laravel package to accomplish this, and we're going to go up underneath the hood. I'm going to show you some code. I'm going to try to do a live presentation, live code, but I made sure the presentation did not hinge on that because live code only works when you're not live. So, we're going to show you how to build your own custom roles and permissions for your own specific domain. So the problem with roles and permissions is that it's just really difficult to do because you're faced with problems like, do I put it at the model level? Do I say you can't, a user can only update tasks, or a user can't work on Saturday, which is at the feature level, and we're going to talk about that too. So that's the issue with it. They also with role hierarchies. So if you say I want to have an admin, and an admin can inherit all the roles from a standard user, but do these things on top. Lock makes that very simple as well. And also, most approaches to roles and permissions are really tedious and error-prone because there's always little security holes. You can find one in just about every website. You can be like, you hack it around enough, you can find you can be somewhere where you're not supposed to be. And that's due to the many moving parts of roles and permissions. So I started thinking about what's the problems and what would make roles and permissions much easier. And one of the things, so if I was going to use a software package, why would I want to use that? And what are some of the deal breakers for me? Everything starts with database schema. So if I use a software package for it, or if I do it from scratch, I want to be able to have my own database schema and be able to say from the how I want to design roles and permissions. These are all the tables I want. These are the fields that I want. And the queries that get ran from that should either allow me to return a value or return nothing. So then I convert that to a Boolean. The other thing that make roles and permissions is that can add some syntactical sugar and also abstract away some of those really confusing queries. So that's what Lock does. That's where Lock comes in. So it allows for flexible access control levels for multiple identities. It also has static and persistent drivers. So it has an array driver, so that an array driver basically will get ran on every single request and load up all your permissions and roles at runtime. Whereas a persistent driver would be a database solution to where you query the database to figure out, is this user allowed to do this particular role? So we're going to talk about that too. And easily implement ACL functionality on your caller or role with trait. That's not going to be very clear right now, but we're going to dive into that later as the talk goes on. So this is how you install Lock. This is from the GitHub page for BeatSwitch Lock, and this is it. Basically, you add your service provider, and you can add some facades so you can say Lock can, Lock will, or cannot. So you can have some facades there for some syntactical sugar. And also, you have to add your configuration file, and you have to, if you're going to use database driver, the default way, the way that it comes, you're going to have to run PHP artisan migrate, and then run the lock migrations. So let's get into some code. Does that make sense so far? This is an introduction. Okay. So first thing we have to do is on the user class, we have to implement an interface called caller, and we have to use a trait called lockAware on the user, and that comes with the package. So once it's installed, don't worry about it. It's not going to be. I'm going to explain how this works later, but right now that's how it's going to. That's what you have to do. The other thing you have to do is caller comes with 3 methods, and those 3 methods are get caller type, and that basically tells you what table that user is going to be found, or not user, the entity of the caller that you have is going to be found. Get caller ID. So if the caller is an entity in your database, you have to specify what the ID it is, and get caller roles. Now I'm going to really narrow down and talk about get caller roles because that really confused me at first. Because one of the issues that I had with it was, why would you hard code those values? I would expect that roles should. I actually have a GitHub issue about this, where it's like I would expect that roles would be a query. Get caller roles would be a query that goes and gets all the roles at runtime for each specific user, because not every user is going to have an editor role or a publisher role. So we're going to talk about that. And task. So I basically am just creating a very simple CRUD app where I have users and tasks, and I want to do some basic testing and be like, this user can view this task, whereas this other user can't view this task. So you also have to, anything that you're going to hook into lock, you have to implement the caller interface. So you have to do the same thing for task as well. Everybody see that? Is that a little fuzzy? That good? You guys can see it? Okay. So I knew we were going to have some issues. So let's run some the migrations. These are the migrations that you run for users, and this is the migration that you run for tasks. So it's just a simple email, password. Just did a little simple CRUD app. I just wanted to see how it works right out of the gate. And also I just have some tasks. And a part of the task you'll see here is the user ID field. So a task belongs to a user, and the user has many tasks. So you see that relationship there. So I'm basically creating tasks that have a user ID on it, and you can reference it. So you can see that the first user 1 here. So the first task belongs to user 1. The second task belongs to user 2. Third task belongs to user 2. The fourth task belongs to user 1. So, and I'll show you in the database what that looks like. So once you run your C, that's what it generates inside of the database. I use the MySQL database or a SQLite database to just less dependencies. Everybody following so far? So this is our typical setup here. And the other thing too is I created a login form. So just so you can log in, because Lock does some interesting things with the authenticated user. So when you log in to Lock, or when you log in and you're using Lock, its service provider picks up on the user that you're logging in as, and it's making some decisions and doing some magic up underneath the hood. And I'm going to show you how the service provider works. I'm going to dive down, and we're going to dive down to the code and see what's actually doing. But that's why you have to have a login form. Now, by default, Lock will create, so if you're not logged in, it'll create a guest role, which has standard guest permissions on it. And you can set those guest permissions. So you can say, so you don't necessarily have to do this, but it makes sense to have a login form and to log in. And this is the sessions controller. This is the code here. This code is just simple, like I send a post request, I grab it, I add the user. It's like no validation. I just did a very simple app. Now, in your case, you're going to want to add some validation and add a lot of architecture stuff in there, but just bare bones for now. So our goal is, so the first user is an admin that can view all tasks. The second user is a standard user that can only view their own tasks. So we're going to go back a few slides here. This email, CEGR01, you guys see that? Can view everything. If I log in as a second user to test email at gmail.com, I can only view tasks 2 and 3. So that's what the goal is. And we're going to start off using the array driver to do it. And the array driver is the default driver that Lock uses. And not really recommended to use, but it's good to play around with. If you're doing a very, very small application, you can probably get away with doing an array driver. If you have a big scale production app, don't use an array driver. Use persistence. So the permissions key is the key to this. So the config file, when we ran the publish config back in step 1, the permissions key is a closure that you use, and that closure will get ran on the boot. If you guys are familiar with Laravel, Laravel has inside of its service provider method, and it will get ran every single time. And what it does underneath the hood is go grab the config, find the permissions key out of the config, and run that closure. So in the config, you'll see the permissions, and it takes in 2 parameters, a manager and a lock instance. And so manager does, manager's like every other manager class. You have a class manager in your code. Everybody has delegator or manager in their code base, but sometimes it's just unavoidable. I think it's a consequence of object-oriented programming. If someone has a better idea of how to do it, I'd love to hear it. But sometimes you just have that in your code. So manager manages the user and the drivers, and it manages the lock instance. In the lock here, this parameter here, the second parameter is the authenticated user. And I'm going to show you how the service provider, in a few slides later, how the service provider handles that. So by default, all permissions are denied. So I have a route. What you see here is a route, and it's just a really simple route that looks up a task, and it checks to see if the authenticated user can read that particular task. So when you hit this route, the parameter will get passed in, and it'll use the array driver to figure out, is this user allowed to view this task? If not, it'll throw an exception. That's typically how you'd want to set up lock. So let's add some code to that closure that we just saw. So, it's not. Can't really see that. Let me. Can you guys see that? So let me see. Get down some code here. I really want to show you. See me now? Good. Okay. So what we have here, so a lot of things are happening because managers do everything. We see the manager getting the driver, and it's figuring out what driver is the driver in an instance of array driver. That's just to keep things safe. What it's doing is it's saying that lock, the second instance, is the authenticated user. So when you log in, it's already going to know I logged in as this authenticated user. And it's running, it's basically saying, go get all the tasks for that user and iterate through each one of them and allow that user to read their own tasks. So that's what it's doing. Is that code making sense? Any confusion there? Okay. So it's saying iterate through each user, for this user, iterate through each one of the user's tasks and give them explicit permissions. Now, again, because it's an array driver, you have to do this on every single iteration. I mean, you have to do this on every single load because this permissions key, the closure and the permissions key will get ran on every single instance or every single page request. So that's what you see here. You're getting permission to read all the tasks.
Is that line something you added, the get task, or did that come with it?
No, I added that because yeah. Now the documentation was clear on a few things, and part of the problems I ran into was, when you're looking at an open source package, there's a lot of assumptions that get made. You're like, oh yeah, they should know how to do that. So I had to really dive into the code quite a bit to figure out how this stuff worked, which is why I'm doing this presentation. And so hopefully it helps you guys, saves you guys some time, but that's some of the things I've come to is like, I want to be able, it's very important for me to be able to say, you can view this instance of this, you can view this task, but not this task. I mean, that's pretty valuable, I think. And if you're building a CRUD application, that's something you have to do, but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying you have individual access to read your own task and only your own task. So that's how I do that there. There's mud.
So do you have to do that for every single one that's using the lock trait? So like you did the task get, so it's caller task. Would you have to do that? Say they had, another as many relation or something. You have to do that for each relation.
Okay. So the question is, we want to know: do I have to iterate through each of the user's tasks every single time? Is that correct?
Well, like say I have another collection called to do, so I'm tasking to do. I have to set up another one of those lines.
Yeah.
Like
I see.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So for every so that's for the bad part about CRUD per se is you do have to do that, and it's wasteful. And I definitely understand. You definitely don't want to. This is a very simple example, and you don't want to waste. Like imagine if you had 1 million tasks or 1 billion tasks. You don't want to sit here and iterate through 1 billion tasks and assign permissions explicitly. You probably want to do it at a little bit higher level, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So yeah, that's a very good question. So after my findings of using the array driver at this point, I'm like, yeah, it's great for prototyping, not optimal for production. Roles are very unclear at this point, because I didn't feel like I felt like at this point I felt like the roles, it wasn't very clear how you set them up because I want to be able to query or say, hey, here's this user's role, and if I log in as a different user, you have a different role. Whereas as you can see here, the getCallerRoles method has editor and publisher, and it's like every user gets that role, which doesn't make any sense. So that's the problem with the array driver. There's no way to attach individual roles at runtime. So I'm like, all right, I'm considering scrapping it at this point. This is my literal thought process as I'm working through this package. And so filtered notes as I'm going through and like figuring out, is this something I want to use? Is this something I don't want to use? So keep going. Everybody see that? Okay. Is that?
Sorry.
Yeah. Permissions. Let's go back to code here. This is the default migrations. So back at that slide where I talked about how to set up and install lock. So this is the migration that comes with it. And it's more of a suggestion, and it's how it works out of the gate. What you'll see here also is a driver and I'll show you the driver here. It depends on the lock driver. Driver's interface. That's right. Here it is. So you can see the driver here. Get caller permissions. It's an interface that it uses, and underneath the hood, it's calling. It's running some queries, and it's assuming that you have this structure, which is you really can't do a whole lot with this. But I'm going to show you that. So also, you have to make sure you remove the permissions closure. That really screwed me up. So if you're going to use the database driver and you're going to go that route, so I've already moved on from the array driver to the database driver, and you have to get rid of the permissions key so that it'll work, won't error out on you. Oh God. So these are the same permissions. I'm going to show you over here. So here we have I created an auth manager class. So if you're going to use the database driver is a little different. There's no closure that you just put in a config here. So you have to have a way to write the permissions or update. So you have to write. Basically, you have to write the up to actually write the permissions and roles into your database, and you do that using the following syntax. See, almost the exact same code is what you saw. Very, very few differences. Except the difference is I had to explicitly get the authenticated user, and I went and got all the user's tasks, as you saw, and I iterate through each one of them, and I say allow this user to read their own particular task. So the same code that I had in the closure in the config. So the result of that, you see in database here, is so I had a route called user management, and the user management route. Can't see that. The user, I'll show you guys what the user management is, but the user management route is basically a route that I use to hit that goes and executes that block of code that you just saw. So it'll go and add all the roles for a particular user, or all the tasks for a particular user. And you see here, this is what it looks like when you do it. Everybody see this second part here? So when you do that, it basically just, that's what it looks like. It creates a lock, so when you run a migrate, it permissions table, and that is the structure of the table, and it adds those rows to the lock permissions table.
There's a row for each one?
For each user. So you see that you have users, and then go on. Oh, okay, we're back on. Cool. So it creates a caller ID. Now the caller ID is the actual user. So it's like a polymorphic, sort of like a polymorphic relation, where it's like I'm going to use the combination of these two fields to figure out which table to look at and which ID to look at. Role here, roles are still null. At this point, I'm not really working with roles. So I'm still not very happy with it, confused, so I'm going to keep pressing on. This type here is a privilege. The other type that you have here is a restriction. So it looks at privilege and restriction and saying a privilege is like you're allowed to read task 1. I mean, you can almost look at this database field and really read it and say this user 1 has the privilege to read task 1. This other, this other user here, this user 1, it's actually the same user, also has the privilege to read task number 4. So And as you can see, that's, I mean, it reads pretty well. And you can run that same execution. You can do the same check here, and I'll show you in the code base here. You can say if the authenticated user can't read this task, throw an exception. So all I've done here is I ran the user management route that writes the permissions, and then I check the permissions. So it's a very simple thing. It's like write the permissions and then read the permissions out. And underneath the hood, it's using the driver to make all of these decisions. And the syntax part is authenticated user can or cannot. I'm actually using a exclamation point here. A not statement, you don't really need that. You can say auth user cannot. At that point, I didn't realize it. I mean, this is literally my raw, unfiltered notes. I'm just going through and procedurally stepping through. What do I want to do? How do I plan on using this package? Any questions so far?
Is that just the Laravel auth facade?
Yes.
It's extending the auth package.
Oh. So the question is this the auth that I'm using in this code, is it the Laravel auth facade? Yes, yeah, I'm not doing anything special with it. I'm not overriding auth. In Laravel you can do some really slick things like override how auth works by changing the guard class. That's some Laravel witchcraft right there. You can do that. It's not doing any of that. But what it is doing is taking lock will take the authenticated user and wrap it in another class called caller lock, which will get you some more functionality. And that's how I'm able to use the syntax auth user can, because of the lock aware trait. And we're going to talk about how the lock aware trait works in a few slides. Does that make sense so far?
Can you go back to your table you're showing us?
Yes. Yeah.
Is this where you actually do the maintenance?
That table right here?
Yeah. No, I mean, it looks like there'd be a role for each privilege that you're granting. Is that right?
A row.
For each task that you're granting a privilege to?
Yes. So for every privilege is completely separate, and so user 1 has the privilege to view one task, and the same user also has the privilege to read another task. So what it's doing is doing a lookup. When it's doing that read, and it's using the syntax can a user view this particular task? It's querying this table, and it's saying, let me break things up into action, privilege type, resource type, and you can even do down to the ID level.
You're not using roles. I assume you would only need to use restrictions if you were using roles in order to pick something out away from the role again. Is it?
Well, I'm not even using roles at the point. I'm just actually tying, and at this point, I'm tying users to permissions directly.
Right. So you wouldn't be using. You said you have privileges and restrictions.
Yes. That's the type. That's that type field.
So you wouldn't be using restrictions.
I'm going to show you. Restrictions is right here. So you can also, I'll show you the code here. You can also do. So in auth manager, you see how I have allow here? I can also say deny. I can also write deny, and I can explicitly say this user cannot is denied.
But if they don't have the privilege in the first place, what's the point of denying?
Oh, I see. Deny will. Okay, that's a good question. So the question was, if they don't have the privilege in the first place, why deny them? Because let's just say that in certain cases where you have this huge, you give this user all these permissions, and they already have it written into the database, deny will override all of those previous permissions that they had. So if the user had permissions to begin with, and then they see that, hey, it will actually query for a deny first before it queries on a permission. And if they're not allowed, regardless of what permission that you have set up, it'll completely block them. Does that make sense? So that's the point of having like this explicit deny.
So it's like explicit deny, and then the privilege deny is like a fallback, right? Is that how it's working, or is it? So like it uses, if you have an explicit deny and it override, and you're doing this is like at the call, right? This isn't overriding anything in the persistence. This is like on the call it says, you have all these permissions, but for this particular thing, no.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And it's smart enough to know how to handle that. And the cool part is the driver takes care of a lot of it. And we're going to really dive down to the driver and talk about it, because the driver is the most interesting part of this application. Everything else is kind of like, it supports so it's like you have all the support structure, and then you're like, how do you want to query? And then it goes, oh, you want to query this way? Boop, boop. Put in a different way of querying these permissions, and it just works. So my findings after default driver, database driver, roles still don't make sense at this point. And I'm like, I don't get this hard-coded roles. And you can't attach roles to individual users because the user class only has hard-coded roles. And so at this point, I'm not getting it, and I'm kind of losing hope and wondering it. So I'm like, the only thing that can redeem it is if I can very easily override one or two classes and actually make what I want. And comes to find out you can. It's because of the open-close principle. Who's familiar with the open-close principle? You guys? Yeah. So I mean, the open-close principle states that it should be open for extension. Code should be open for extension, but closed for modification. So that's what we're going to talk about, and how this package uses the open-close principle to allow me to do what I need to do. So we're going to look at the database driver, and we're going to change our implementation of the database driver. And so I'm like, all right, cool. Maybe this will work. So overriding the locked service provider. We're going to get down into the service provider and look at what's going on here. So if you look at the locked service provider, you notice the boot method here. Let's see if we can. There we go. So notice the boot method. This is what I was talking about earlier. It goes and looks into config, grabs the permissions key, runs that callback. If you guys are familiar with the call user func class or function, it allows you to just call callbacks, pass parameters. It's pretty cool. All that functional programming goodness. So parts we're going to focus on is the get driver method. And the get so by default, you see that it returns a new database driver. So we're going to look at this database driver here. You'll see methods for get caller permissions, store caller permission, remove caller permission. And so queries look kind of gnarly, but what it's really doing is it's saying, so when you, for example, when you're getting all the caller permissions, you're saying, go query this table that I have and give me all the permissions. And it uses a permission factory to structure the data in a certain way, because in PHP you can't really do listconf properly because you can't have strong return types. You have to do some weird stuff like add a factory that transforms data back into what you want it to look like, so it works with the rest of your code and it just flows nicely. So that's what it's doing. It's basically the driver is making all those queries happen and making all those decisions, saying this user can do that, this user can do that, based on those keywords. The action is read, deny, what caller type that you want to have permissions on. So that's how this database driver is working. So at this point, I'm like, all right, well, if I'm going to write my own driver and run my own queries and make my own schema, this is the place where I need to change it. So that's what I do. I go in and I override the database driver, which is pretty ambitious, but that's what needs to be done. So the other thing I wanted to point out, I'll show you the code here. The slides aren't really clear. Is the bootstrap auth user lock. Now, in this particular segment, keep in mind we're inside the lock service provider, and so what I'm doing, the reason why I'm focusing on this is how lock knows what to do with the authenticated user and what permissions to assign to the authenticated user. So it goes and grabs the user, and it's saying, it's calling that user, it's going and calling it, and then it's saying set lock, and what that does is it sets a lock aware trait on the actual user. So you can say, that's how I'm able to say auth user can, even though you've never seen me actually put inside the user class, you don't see can anywhere on this user class, but there's a lock aware trait that gets assigned, that you want to assign to it, and if you don't have it, it'll actually assign it for you inside the service provider, which is really cool. And we're going to look at the lock aware trait. And you can see can and cannot and allow and deny and all that stuff. Toggle's a little different. Toggle is, you want to use toggle for if you have a UI. So when you're hitting a checkbox, it'll go figure out, does the user already have a permission? Well, if it's unchecked, then reverse it. So it gives you these great set of tools that you can run on the actual user. And what can does, I'm going to dive down a little bit more. Let's see. Lock. So you have a caller lock that extends this abstract class called lock, and that's where the meat and potatoes is. And when you call can, what you notice is it's calling this get permissions. And when it's calling get permissions, it's going up underneath the hood. So if you're going inside of your caller lock class, and you see this get permissions, you see this get driver, get caller permissions. So I'm like, I bet I can override that. At this point, I'm like, I bet I can override all of these. And that's the point. You see, this get driver, store caller permissions. So I can pass in any instance of as long as it implements the driver interface, which we saw earlier, I can go and just override how I want it to do whatever I want. And I'm excited at this point. I'm like, all right, I have some power. Unlimited power. So let's look at this driver here. So whipping out some old UML diagrams. What you see here is that this abstract class called lock has a get driver method on it, and caller lock also has this other method that's called get lock instances for caller roles. And what that does is it allows me to, at this point I realized I can also add a query for the roles, and at runtime go grab all the roles for a particular user, which is a pretty big deal. So that gives me what I want. It gives me the ability to work with roles and say, I can assign standard user or admin user for a particular user, and it'll just query that at runtime and know what to do with it. And use the driver to write all my queries for it. Because the driver has all of these methods on it, and I can override that. So this is what I really, really want. I want something that looks like this. Because and notice the rollables and the permissionables. That's kind of weird. What's that? I've never had a reason to use Morph Mini. You guys had a reason to use Morph Mini in Laravel yet? Yeah.
I don't remember why I used it.
Huh?
I don't remember when I used it.
Yeah. So normally what you'd have is a role user table. That's typically what you see, but why wouldn't you want to use a role user in this case?
One role, it's a many things.
Right, exactly. So I can say like a role can not just belong to a user, but right. And I can say a role can have. I can also say role organization or role ham sandwich maker or whatever class that I see fit to put here. So I don't like. So in most tables, what I would see in most role permission thing, I'd see a roles table, I'd see a permissions table, and then I would see some combination of user role or user permission. And what that does is only a user can be tied to a role, and only a user can be tied to permission. But if I say rollables, then I can have a caller type and a caller ID, and I can attach a user to it, or I can attach a ham sandwich maker to it, or an organization. And I can do the same on permissions as well. And so now you see I can attach users to it. I can attach users to permissions, and then I can task to permissionables. Is that?
Instead of having one catch-all table for all permissions.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Instead of having, for the record, what did you say? Instead of having
like one catch-all table, but the first table you're showing uses the object type ID or object ID and object type ID to make one catch-all table to have, say, if you have a note or a task or to do all these different object types with their IDs, and then they're associated. You have these separated out in the tables now, which is clean. I think.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I want. I mean, this is what I want to do. And it's at this point I'm still like, can I do this? Because this is what's going to give me the ability to say a user has this role, and this role has all of these permissions. Therefore, this user is allowed to do these things. Or I can say this organization has a role, and this role has all of these permissions. Therefore, this organization can do all of these things, and I'm not restricted to just a user. That's a little bit more readable, right? Let's read that.
Can you go back just is the second table in the first column? Is that, I can't quite read that. Is that role users?
This one? Or
The second in the first column, the second one down.
This rollables?
Is that role users?
That's rollables.
Role what?
Rollables.
No, the first one is roles, isn't it?
Yeah, the first one's roles and the second one's rollables.
Rollables.
Yeah, rollables. Yeah, it's a Laravel. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's like it's like a Laravel convention for handling polymorphic relations.
That's what that's.
Yeah, it's.
So you don't. So one user can only have one role. You can't assign multiple roles.
No, you can assign. It's a many to many. It's a.
I don't see many.
Oh, I see. It's done through the rollables table. Yeah. The many to many comes from, you see the caller type and the caller ID. Imagine if that was like a role use. Imagine if that was a role user join table. If that makes sense.
So it's a pivot table.
Pivot table. Yes, I meant pivot table. Yeah.
So you could have like a caller type of, like here's an example of organization, or a caller type of user in that role table.
Yeah.
So multiple entities could have roles.
Yeah.
And use that same word.
You have to end that sentence with inception. So roles are tied. I can tie roles to anything. I don't have to tie roles to users if I don't want to. I can tie roles to any other entity type because the caller type and the caller ID are both identifiers. So I can say the caller type is an identifier of what table, and then the caller ID is, and like now that we're at the table, it'll give you the ID of that particular table. That's how Laravel handles polymorphic relations. It's pretty cool. So that follow along. And these are all the migrations that I did to make this schema possible. So the next few slides are all the migrations that are required to make this schema. And I will show you make it really clear. Database migrations. Switch on the branch here. Okay. Look, Git. So easy. So you'll see that I have a roles table here, and I have a permissions table, and this is how Laravel sets up migrations. So you guys are familiar with that. I have a permission role, which attaches. So that's how I know which role has which permission. Then I have a permissionables table, and again, think of like when you see the word in Laravel convention, you see permissionables, or you see anything that ends in able. It basically means it's polymorphic relation, and you need two identifiers to figure out. Well, the first identifier is the table, and the second identifier is the ID of the entity you're trying to query on. It's pretty cool. And then rollables. Now I will show you show what this looks like. If you roll here, it says morph by many. And so I can say role has many users, but it has it through this rollables table, and that's the syntax that you have to use to identify. Okay, how do I find a user that's attached to a role? And same thing with permissions. Well, this is a belongs to many. So a role, roles and permissions have a many-to-many relationship. And you guys understand why I'm setting up the tables this way? Is that making sense? Because because what I want to do, I want to make sure that I can make all the decisions that I need to make. So without doing it this way, I don't have the flexibility to make all the decisions. Like, can this user do that? I can find.
What's an example of a decision you would be able to make if you didn't set it up this way, like the way they had it before?
Well, you would just end up needing more tables for population.
Maybe like a limitation that you had before this solve for you.
Right. The limitation I kept running into was with roles. I wanted to be able to attach multiple roles to a user. And the way that it was before, I wasn't able to attach multiple roles to a user because there was no architecture in place to do that. It kind of gave you this there's one thing I could change about the package. It'd be like the docs. I'd make it a little bit clearer. Like, I don't have to put like inside this user class, for example. Now this is the later iteration here, but that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to query on each user's roles, grab the names off the roles, and turn it into an array, rather than saying something like return, I don't know, admin. That doesn't make any sense because that's saying that every user is an admin.
I think by them making that an interface that they want to use
choose to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it just really confused me at first because I was like,
If you didn't want to do it the way you ended up doing it, you could just say like you could have a flag on the user, like for example, is admin could give server role. But they're leaving it up to you.
right, right. So yeah, they do definitely, it leaves it open for interpretation, but it like the way that, but when you're reading a package, you know, like the documentation on a package, you kind of go with the flow of it, and so when I was just like, yeah, I'm supposed to be standing up, and I was like, wait, that doesn't make sense. I was like, I need hierarchy, I need some architecture in place to be able to say, this user, look up all of your roles, and then therefore, since all of your permissions will be written ahead of time, hopefully through a UI or through Cedar. I only do it through Cedar for the sake of this presentation, but you'd want a UI, and you want to set those things, and then I want to say, hey, user, go get all your roles. All right, cool. Now, what permissions are you allowed to do? Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this? That's what it's doing. That's what the architecture in place would do, allow me to do. So, let's see. These are all the tables I showed you. Showed you the user class. Showed you the roles. So let's still seed roles and permissions. So that's the next part of it is how do I seed all the roles? How do I write all the roles in? So it's great. I have this nice schema. How do I write to it? And writing to it is a two-part system. It's first of all, I had to update the driver in order to perform the correct writes, which I will show you. A lot of tabs open. So I created a demo driver, and I wrote, so I had, and it implements the driver interface. You guys see that pretty clear? Okay. So the demo driver is the key to the whole thing. If you don't get anything else out of this talk, just know that the driver is magic, and if you know how to work with the driver, you can do whatever the heck you want to do with roles permissions. And so I created this get caller permissions, and what it does is it joins. It's doing some joins in here, but it's going to say join on permissionables or join permissionables table on caller type and caller ID, where the caller that I'm passing in is the type, and the ID that I'm passing in is the ID. That syntax here, I use the query. I use the what's it called, query builder. It's a little bit faster. How that would look inside of using the eloquent syntax would be a much simpler eloquent syntax, but I wanted to be pretty explicit and get down into understanding what it's doing and what tables I'm joining on, because I was trying to learn how this works. But the syntax you probably want to use is caller and then permissions. And it'll just go grab all those permissions for you based on the database schema that you have set up. When you want to store a permission, you have to do an insert on permissions. So this is when you want to write a permission. This is like underneath the hood when you're using. You have a question? Good. Okay. So underneath the hood, when you let me show you here. These are permission seeder. So when I want to write permission to it, and I say, take this role that I have, which is Saturday TPS report specialist role. I can assign a role to that, and I can say allow this user to work on Saturday, and which entity that I want to write it on. And what it's doing is it's going up underneath the hood and saying, hey driver, how do I write this permission? And it's going to this method to write that permission, and it's setting up. So it has to write to the permissions table, then it writes to the permissionables table to create those joins. or to create that those it creates that pivot so you can attach the stuff you need to attach. You also need to remove it. Now, I was wondering, when does remove ever get ran? And remove gets ran when you deny something. So when you say you want to deny something, it'll go and figure out what you have, to remove it, call this remove method, and then add another field to it, add another permission to it that says restriction on it. So all you have to have is like this base, you have to have like a base understanding of your schema, and it does all of the other little annoying things for you. All those little tidbits, like what if I deny something? What if I allow something? What if I deny something and then allow it? It's going in and it's removing that permission that denies.
It's removing a restriction too.
Right, exactly. It's removing a restriction, then going in and adding another permission that has an allow on it. It has a privilege.
To not confuse it with completely removing that permission from the database for good.
Well, in this case, it's doing it on the database.
So
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty neat. And has, so I was like, why would I want to use has? Has keeps duplicates from occurring. So it'll run has first to figure out, do you already have this permission? And if you do, it'll just leave it alone. If you don't, it'll add it. So it prevents duplicates from going in. So it's a really smart. I was really, at this point, I'm just blown away. I'm just like, this is worth demoing it at a Laravel talk. The fact that I can do that, and also I also have my own custom service provider. Because if you remember that get driver method, all I have to do is figure out which thing I want to use, and say return my lock demo driver that I wrote, and of course, don't forget, how many times do you guys keep forgetting this? Service providers. Composer install gets me every time, or Composer dump auto load. It's just like, But so you have to make sure that you include that new custom driver, or the new custom service provider, and leave everything else alone, and it'll load your driver. It's magic. It's pretty awesome. So there's a lot of power in that. So now with all that set up, I can go back to task and say, this user if you can't read all the tasks, or if you can, you can read all of your own tasks, it makes all those decisions, and it's using the database to do that. So let's work on a weekend work. Let's build a weekend work detector. So the scope of this project is some people can work on Saturdays and some people can work on Sundays, but not both. And so this is how you build a permission this is how you build roles permissions on a feature and not a CRUD object. Because the problem is that it's CRUD, nobody really uses CRUD. I mean, really, for big scale applications, it's really rare when I think of something in terms of like complete CRUD. Most of the time it's some kind of delegator or some kind of architecture that you have, and that's one of the questions that when I was talking to Ben, another guy who works here, he was like, "Can you add something on features?" And I was like, "That's pretty good. Yeah, that'd be something I want to do." So let's build something called a weekend work detector, where it detects, can a user work on this day or can they not? So to do that, we're going to simplify our architecture just a little bit. And I kept the users in there, but I removed the task because we're no longer working with tasks. We're going to work on an actual class. And it's called the TPS report generator class. So notice there's no TPS report generator class because it's not a CRUD object. So let's go look at this. I showed you guys this earlier, but I'm going to show you again. So, user 1 is a Saturday worker. So Lumberg can tell this guy, I'm going to work you on Saturday. User 2 is a Sunday worker. So I want to be able, so I have a class called TPS report generator, and I'm going to show you that. And it has 2 methods on it. It has work on Saturday, work on Sunday. But the cool part about this TPS report generator, I can make it implement caller. That's the cool part. I don't have to put that. It doesn't have to be a CRUD object. It doesn't have to be something like dogs or cats or tasks. I can put it on a feature. And generally, the TPS report generator will be like your manager or your delegator. So if you're working on a pretty large code base, your delegator is going to implement caller. And so you'd have, I don't know, name a class that you have. We have message query service delegator, and so I can put permissions on there and say you can't query on messages if you're not this type of user. So I can do that. So I can pass in the authenticated user, which is a caller object, and I can also, so I'm saying, doing a check here and saying, can this user perform this permission name? And the permission name would be what we saw here earlier. Work on Saturday, work on Sunday. So I can say, can this user work on Saturday on the TPS report generator? So basically I'm calling the method, and I'm saying the class that I have. And the class here, that TPS report generator, comes from getCallerType. So it's able. So I can say getCallerType, and I can say that is the class or the entity that I want to check permissions on. So when I go and I write my permissions here, again, this would be done through a CRUD interface. Is this making sense so far? So I can say allow work on Saturday TPS report generator. Then I just attach that role to that user using the Laravel syntax. It's all about eloquent. This query right here would be pretty, I'd say it'd be pretty, not really difficult, but you know, it would take some work. It'd be a lot more than one line. You know, I'd have to do some joins to get that to work, which is what I love about Laravel. It's like you can just pass in, create a role, pass it in, it just does what it needs to do. And same thing here for the Sunday worker. So looking at what I just, so this is the result of what I just wrote. The result is, let's break this down. I have permissions table. I have 2 privileges here. I have 1 Saturday worker, work on Saturday, and the resource type is a TPS generator. And you guys remember where the resource type came from? I'll show you again because it's really important. It's a really important detail. When you have the TPS report generator, and I say getCallerType, that's what it's using. I'm muted?
No.
Okay. That's what it's using. It's using that, it's going back and looking at that TPS report generator. That's how it knows what type to query on.
So the caller type is like object or entity type, just knowing the table or the type object.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a way to attach, like, this is what I want. It's a delegator basically, or the entity. It's a way to attach that permission. So this is the pivot tables here. So from that, I know that that's how I attach permissions to roles, and then I can say roles. So I have a Saturday TPS report specialist. I have 2 roles, and I also have a Sunday TPS report specialist. Those are the 2 roles. But then I can attach the user to the role, which is pretty cool through the rollables table. And if you notice here, notice the rollables table here is role ID and then caller type and caller ID. So what you're probably used to seeing is a role or user role table or role user table. A little bit more flexible. It allows me to attach any kind of entity that I want. So that's how I know which role to assign to which user. So user 1 is a Saturday TPS report specialist, whereas user 2 is a Sunday TPS report specialist.
So you think rollables is a variable? That's for the basic variable authentication?
It's a well, rollables is what's called a. So anytime you add a bowl, or able at the end of an entity, you're basically saying that it's a polymorphic relation. You're saying it has polymorphic behavior. A polymorphic behavior, I'm able to have. I can explain. I don't have. So you see this caller type? I can say company on rollables table. I can say company, and then caller ID, I can have the ID. And instead of looking in the users table, it'll look in a company's table and go get the ID of the company.
Okay.
So that's where...
It's still a many table.
Absolutely, yes. It's just a little bit more flexible many-to-many table because it allows me to put more different entities, different entity types on that. It's just... No, that's a very good question. Yeah.
That's really all it is. Because you can name it whatever you want. You just would have to pass an additional parameter where you define that relationship in the class with giving it your special name. But that's just the convention that they follow.
It's a very entity aware many
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I already showed you the TPS report generator. So what it does, so on work on Saturday, it'll do an auth check, and it's saying, is this user allowed to work on Saturday? So I have this. So now I have this syntax here, and the auth checks will protect the method that will take in permission name and what day it is, and it'll throw an exception if you're not allowed to work on Saturday. So it's pretty powerful. I mean, I think that's really powerful. Don't you guys think? Say it's like pretty. I don't know. I've seen. I think I've screwed around with like Sentry and some of my own techniques. Like none of them were. I wasn't very satisfied. I was very dissatisfied with how it handled things and how I handled things on my own stuff. Where I was like, I came up with one method where I would check each controller action, and I would assign roles to this role can do all of these controller actions, but it's just, I don't know, like it's kind of dirty because it's so limited to a controller, and that's just not a really good way of doing it. So I really enjoy. I feel like this is a really good way of doing it because I can attach it to whatever I want. I can get down into any method and be like, I want to do an auth check on that, and it gives you the freedom and flexibility to do that. And also, I can have my own schema. I don't have to use the schema that I had worked for me, and I think it might work for our application, but it may not work for yours, but you can override it and write your own. And then you can have your own permission checking on it, which is really, really cool.
What's really neat on top of it, from what I can tell, because of the driver, you can customize your own schemas, you can get in nitty-gritty and change the driver, and it's open and closed. Not only is it great for custom rolling your own, or just using this, but on top of Sentry, because Sentry's permission system sucks. Because I use it too, and I don't like it at all. It's key value relation, serialized array in the table. This allows you to make, you can actually cut the whole roles concept and use the users group too, if you want to. Say you have users and user groups, and each user group has permissions tied to it. Because Sentry, this is an awesome enhancement. Just say you have a project that's completely Sentry. Not a great idea, but if it is, this would be a great addition to it to add those extra permissions without having to hack Sentry apart to get it to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's let's see. That's So, oh yeah, invoking this security. You guys see that? Is that a little bit clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we want to invoke it, I can say, you know, get the user, pass it in the TPS report generator, and then call work on Saturday. It'll throw an exception if I'm not allowed to work on Saturday. So I don't notice I don't have any auth checking here. You know, because if you run around on a feature, you can put the auth checking inside of the feature that you want, so you don't have to have auth check, if auth check all over your code base. It's just sloppy. You know, I can just outside of the client to this can just call it and it'll just work. Because all of it's abstracted inside. Questions?
Have you tried, like what I talked about, integrating it against a good package? I mean, like Sentry or?
No. I was pretty turned off by the fact of using a package for permissions. You know, it really got me looking into it as a conversation. John and it was like we were at Doc Bros one day, and me, John, and Brian were talking about it, and they were like, "This would be really cool. To do what we want to do and make it a lot simpler." And that's what really got me into it. And I was like, I don't know. I was still like, I don't know. Like the whole time I was really doing this, I was like, until I saw that I could override that driver, and I was like, yes. I was actually going to change the topic of my talk about 2 weeks ago until I realized the driver was there, and I was like, that's gold. That's what I want.
Are there any other drivers, default drivers other than the
Yeah, I mean the array driver, and then the database, the standard database driver that it comes with, but it has flat roles. Like the role, it just didn't make the schema just didn't make sense. I spent hours looking at the default database driver that came with lock, and I was like, there's really no way you can create that because there's no architecture of many roles to many users. You know, there just isn't. It just didn't exist, and I was really disappointed. Then I realized I could create one, so I wouldn't. I just use our own driver, really. Yeah.
This is pretty close to the it's not really just in the same especially.
Oh yeah, it's a standalone package. So there's Lock has two packages. It has a standard PHP package and a Laravel package. Yeah, and so the Laravel package will bring in the standard PHP package, but then add the service providers and stuff to it.
So there, I mean, I guess you can integrate the Symphony or whatever you want.
Oh, absolutely. So, sorry, is that the mic picked up on the other questions?
I don't think so.
Okay. You're saying that. So basically, you were saying that can you use this project outside of Laravel? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it looked like it was designed to be.
Yeah. So so throughout the presentation, I showed you guys the Laravel version of it, and it had the Laravel service providers. But you don't have to use that. You can install the standard lock driver. I'm sorry, the standard lock package, and you can get it from. Let's see. So there's two of them. One's lock, and then the other one is lock Laravel. And so they, so if you're using the standard lock, you're going to have to kind of create your own boot sequence for it. That's really with if you guys aren't familiar with service providers, but service providers allow you to boot. So basically gives you that. It's like, hey, here's the thing that makes all my classes. It gets all the classes, puts them together at runtime, and gives you one class with everything in it, so you can just work with it. So you'd have to write one of those yourself if you're using standard lock. But yeah.
How did you land on lock? Was it just the most popular package?
We were all sitting in lunch talking about there was nothing really in PHP that had a good sort of auth permission thing, just like Carl was talking about. And right into a Ruby background, we're talking about can.
That's right.
Is everyone familiar with can? So apparently it's a really clean way to say this user can do this, or these users cannot do this, or whatever. So lock is a really similar thing that he went out and found after we talked about that. So after that, Charles and I talked about it a little more. It's kind of how, that's how I heard about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was still like I was still racking my brain around how could you do it from scratch, because I was of the opinion that you can't use a package for this, because for the reason that what if you have a different schema and a different different queries that you need to run to get your permissions to get checked properly, and that's why like lock gets out of the way. Lock says, all right, I'm going to give you like the syntax and the syntactical sugar, but you decide how you want the schema, and you decide how you want to query on different things. So like the cool part was like when you can deny something, it'll go and find what's allowed on that same permission and go delete it, and then add a restriction. Like, whoa, that's really cool because it's got like the structure to do it, and then when it gets ready to call what you want to do, it just gets out of the way and says, okay, this get driver, and then it goes and gets the class that it needs and loads the driver and runs the queries that it needs based on that driver. So
the deny was the one you said would run at runtime, right? Or would you use that at a seeder and have the seeder set?
I
see. What I'm saying? Like, this is something where I can, on my method invocation or whatever, say, all right, you're good, your permissions are set, but for this one particular thing, deny your particular roles. Or is it something where you have to see the database?
I see. So the question was, when you use deny, is it smart enough? Like, let's see if I'm quite phrasing it right for the camera. So if you use deny, do I have to seed ahead of time?
Yeah. So like, am I thinking of the architecture ahead of time and saying, for this one particular feature, I know that my database needs to not have that? Or is it something where in runtime, when I'm going to this controller method, and in the controller method, I, for some whatever reason, need to deny that permission, even though they say have an administrator permission, but you have a super admin, you want to deny this one tiny little feature.
Okay.
Do you have to go back and then run your seed and then it's available?
Right.
Deny as it's running.
Okay, so it will. So the question is, is it smart enough to deny or allow something as it's running at runtime? The answer is the UI. So you set the permissions. You write the permissions in a UI. Ideally, if you have a feature and you want to say, okay, I want every single standard user to have this feature, you would create a UI for yourself that does all the writing. And then when you want to deny something, you have to actually go in and explicitly through the UI or through your seeder deny that user.
Gotcha. So you want to do it at the persistence level, not try to throw it in different parts of your code.
Absolutely.
Randomly deny stuff or whatever.
Absolutely. Preferably you want an internal app. Like, you want an internal app where you manage all those permissions. Like if you want to put a CRUD app, for example, if you want to put it on like a task, you want to add permissions, you'd want a hook. You'd want to like say each user that I add also go in and add that task permission. Or if they have a feature, if they like you want to have some kind of event sequence if you're not doing the UI way. But your rights should always be separate from your reads on permissions.
It's not a question, but I have a big use case for this. I really like this is kind of modular. And in my particular company, we have more than the traditional users to roles. We also have users to location, users to roles, users to projects, and then all of those connected permissions. So a user may have plenty of, they may have high-level access to the system, but they're denied specific projects because we don't have I'm a related to, we have offshore users and onshore users and third-party vendors. So third-party vendors may not have signed contracts to see certain data. And so there's a lot of permissions and stuff that we use in our application that I wish was built like this. It is a great way of segregating that out and controlling, rather than building what we currently have is 2 or 3 different security mechanisms built on top of one another that does potentially cause a hole. I mean, literally, there's hooks in the code that's it's the person offshore, oh yeah, it's shut down, versus dipping into the database and seeing that. It's a way of putting that together. I was a little upset. I was a little kind of worried at the beginning because it seemed like there's a lot of overage you got to do to get it to a usable state. There's roles in multiple roles to users, kind of a common thing. And in our case, of having all these extra layers, I wouldn't want to necessarily go to download a tool and have to already reverse engineer it. But now, singly, what you've done with it, I think it's a great building upon that to drive.
Oh, thank you.
So what's really cool, another thing I noticed is you can go in reverse. So as far you love it because you can go super deep into it and say, like, to the minuscule level, I want to control permissions this way. But what if you wanted to, instead of applying your permissions to the user, say you wanted to just worry about permissions on the user groups. So you can set the trait of the groups. Table and say, if you're administrator, if you're offshore secretary of this is the permissions that group has. User doesn't matter because you're checking at the user groups. So that's kind of cool too, because you can reverse it to where it can be lax. Really, I just need to know, are you administrator or are you user?
Yeah.
If you're a user, you have these roles and permissions, and if you're an administrator, you have permissions. So it's reversed too.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty cool.
It looks like you'd be able to build it where it kind of goes down a different level of, like, yes, you have this permission, and you're in this group, and you're in this location, and you allow.
Yeah.
It seems like that would be kind of easy to build out, kind of tack on extra statements in the off check.
So are you all working on putting this in production? Is this something you're exploring?
Yeah, we're exploring it right now. Right now we have our way of doing roles and permissions, but we're trying to improve on it a little bit, trying to figure out how we're going to make it more scalable because our app just keeps growing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the problem with software. It just keeps growing. Yeah. Great. More questions? Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome.